Your wall doesn't meet our aesthetic standards. It needs to go. That was the ultimatum my HOA delivered right before they made one of the most reckless decisions imaginable. They tore down the only thing preventing a mountain from collapsing, my engineered retaining wall, the one barrier holding back a deadly mass of soil just waiting to crash down. Nearly 4 decades of engineering experience didn't matter to them. They chose appearance over safety, style over structural necessity. Less than a month later, in the dead of night, the mountain made its move. The noise shattered the calm across multiple neighborhoods. And what followed the shouting, panic, chaos, that was just the start. What I uncovered about my HOA that night, it'll infuriate you. Anna Dramanesta reveals some of the most absurd power grabs you've ever seen. Drop your country in the comments because this madness isn't just local, it's happening everywhere. 5 years before it all unraveled, I bought a home in Marlow Heights, what most would consider a nightmare. A steep backyard that plunged into a canyon I saw as an opportunity. A slope over 35 feet tall, holding back unstable dirt, ready to give into gravity. Where others saw risk, I saw a challenge. After decades designing earthquake-resistant tunnels and foundations, building a solid retaining wall was the perfect retirement project to something useful that also protected my neighbors. I spent 3 focused months constructing it. 10 feet tall, nearly 40 feet long, reinforced with proper drainage, steel mesh, and a rock-solid foundation. I followed every regulation, filed all the permits, and passed every single inspection. The county engineer even called it textbook-grade slope stabilization. And for years, that wall did exactly what I built it to do. It quietly kept the hillside in place, protected half a dozen homes, and offered peace of mind, especially when heavy rains came. Then along came Vivian Thorne. She'd just become president of the HOA. Her background, interior design. Her mission, aesthetic unity across the neighborhood. I called it what it really was, a thirst for control. Vivian had only lived in our community a few months before launching her campaign to elevate the look of everything. She wanted conformity, clean lines. And apparently, my rugged, functional wall didn't match her curated vision. Our first real conversation was at a community barbecue. I was flipping burgers when she walked over, wine in hand, smile tight and eyes colder than the drink in her glass. "Arthur," she said, gesturing toward the slope behind my house, "that wall really disrupts the natural flow of the hillside. It's so industrial. Have you thought about something more organic?" I set down my spatula. "Vivian, that wall isn't about looks. It's keeping tons of unstable earth from crashing into the neighborhood." She actually chuckled. "We have drainage systems," she said. "Engineering is overrated. Nature knows how to balance itself." Right then, I knew trouble was brewing. A younger neighbor, freshly graduated in landscape architecture, nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Natural systems work better when we stop interfering with them." I stared at both of them, people who had never witnessed what happens when a slope gives way, and tried again. "This wall doesn't oppose nature," I said. "It respects physics. And gravity doesn't care how peaceful your landscaping looks." Vivian had already turned and walked off, dismissing me with a flick of her hand. 2 weeks later, I found a notice under my windshield, "Unapproved structure on property. Immediate action required." I stared at the slip, then went straight to my files. I had everything: permits, soil assessments, inspection reports, engineering specs, and even a geological survey dating back to the 90s that flagged our area as a landslide risk. I submitted a complete report to the HOA, photos, documentation, expert evaluations, everything. I spelled it out clearly. That wall wasn't an eyesore, it was the only thing keeping several homes from disaster. The HOA ignored it. Next came the fines, then an official demand to remove the wall within 60 days. Eleanor Vance, the HOA treasurer, personally delivered each notice. Soft-spoken and always wearing floral sweaters, she clearly hated being involved. When she handed me the final warning, she leaned in and whispered, "Arthur, I think you are right about the slope." She looked over her shoulder, like saying even that much could get her in trouble, and walked off. The standoff reached a boiling point at the next HOA meeting. Vivian came armed with a slideshow, filled with photos of my wall labeled as visual violations. She stood before the community, clicking through slides like she was pitching a rebranding campaign. "This structure," she said, pointing to a shot of my wall, represents the very thing we're trying to change. It's harsh, obtrusive, and gives the impression that function matters more than form. I stood up. That wall, I said, loud enough to hush the murmurs, is holding back tons of soil. You might not like how it looks, but it's the only thing preventing your homes from sliding into the canyon. I have 15 years worth of data showing this land is unstable. I have permits. I have past inspections. What I don't have is patience for people who think they can outvote gravity. A younger resident fired back. You're fearmongering. Nature finds balance. You're just trying to scare everyone with doomsday predictions. An elderly neighbor shifted uncomfortably. But what if Arthur's right? He asked softly. Vivian, ever the politician, turned on her smile. We'll let the community decide, she said. That's how democracy works. In favor of requiring Mr. Sterling to dismantle his visually disruptive structure. Hands went up across the room without hesitation. Every single person voted yes except me. Just like that, decades of engineering experience were thrown out by people who believed wishful thinking could stop a landslide. The final notice came printed on expensive paper, embossed with the HOA's official seal, as if trying to make foolishness look professional. Eleanor was the one who handed it to me, her eyes full of unease. As she passed it over, she leaned in and whispered, Arthur, I know you're right about the danger, but I'm scared of her. Vivian doesn't take kindly to resistance. She finds ways to make life very difficult. The fear in her face said more than her words did. That's when I understood that this wasn't about landscaping anymore. This was about power, about control, and about what people will do when they think they're untouchable. But what was Eleanor so afraid of? What did she know that could unravel everything if it got out? Type secrets if you think Eleanor is hiding more than she's letting on. Faced with the impossible, I did what any seasoned engineer would. I gathered proof, relentlessly. Over the next week, I built a case no reasonable person could ignore. Photos from every angle of the slope, 10 years worth of local weather data, geological records from the county office, charts showing the composition of the soil, water absorption rates, slope grading stats. My dining room looked like the nerve center of a disaster response team. When I was done, I had a 15-page report packed with technical detail, legal references, and visual documentation. I cited county ordinances for slope safety, quoted liability codes, and provided before and after photos from neighborhoods where similar walls had been removed with devastating results. I sent certified copies to every member of the HOA board and also to the county planning department. For a brief moment, I let myself believe it might actually work. That maybe, just maybe, someone would open that binder, see the cold hard facts, and realize they were on the verge of triggering a disaster. I should have known better. These weren't people guided by facts. They were driven by opinions, and they'd made up their minds long ago. My report might as well have been printed in a foreign language. Then came the truck. I was on my patio, sipping coffee, when I heard the rumble. A white pickup rolled up beside my fence. Green Valley Solutions stenciled across the door. Two men in safety vests hopped out, one carrying a clipboard, the other leading a small excavator. The man with the clipboard approached my gate. Morning, he said. We're here to remove the unapproved retaining wall. Work orders from the HOA. I calmly set my mug down. No sudden move as I didn't want them to see my hands shaking with rage. Gentlemen, I said, voice steady. This is private property. That wall is legally permitted and structurally essential. Touch one stone, and I'm calling the police. And if anything happens after you remove it, your names will be on the incident report when this hillside collapses. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Do you really want to be the contractors mentioned in the lawsuit when someone's sunroom ends up halfway down the canyon wrapped around a tree? They froze, looked at each other, then at the clipboard, then back at me. After a quiet conversation, they packed up their gear and left without another word. For a minute, I thought maybe I'd finally gotten through. But at the next home meeting, the hostility had only grown. Vivian came prepared again, this time with an extended presentation about the HOA's legal rights to enforce visual standards for property value. She read her statement like a courtroom prosecutor, citing clause after clause about maintaining community harmony through uniform aesthetics. When she finished, I stood up once more. "You can vote against my wall all you want," I said. "But gravity doesn't care about your bylaws. The laws of physics aren't up for debate." The young neighbor was ready for me this time. "Stop scaring everyone with your end-of-the-world nonsense. This fearmongering isn't helping." But I saw something shift in the room. Doubt. Even if no one said it out loud, a few faces started to look unsure. The older gentleman, a retired teacher, 3 doors down, it cleared his throat. "I don't want to wake up and find my living room sliding down the hill, Vivian. Maybe we should actually listen to the guy who builds bridges for a living." Some neighbors nodded. For a flicker of a second, I thought rational thought might win. Then Vivian called for a vote, and once again, hands rose, some hesitant, some sheepish, but all in agreement. Same verdict: tear down the wall. That night, I sat alone in my garage with a sealed bottle of whiskey I didn't even open. For the first time, I questioned myself. 37 years of engineering, thousands of hours calculating stress loads and slope angles, and here I was, being undone by someone with a certificate in throw pillows and paint swatches. I stared into the dark. "Maybe I'm overreacting," I said out loud. "Maybe I really am just some cranky old man yelling about dirt and gravity. Maybe they're right." I picked up the phone and called my son in Colorado. "Dad?" He answered. "You sound off. What's going on?" I told him everything. There was a long pause on the line. "Dad," my son finally said, "remember when you taught me about gravity when I was 6? You told me some forces aren't open to negotiation. Sounds like you're dealing with people who think they can vote their way around physics." 2 weeks later, while I was at the dentist having my teeth cleaned, they made their move. I came home to find my side gate wide open, and my backyard looked like a demolition zone. The Summit landscape crew had gone through my retaining wall like it was packing foam, stones thrown everywhere, support mesh shredded, plants trampled into the dirt. 3 workers were finishing up, tossing the last pieces of rubble into a dump truck. I approached the crew, a wiry man with twitchy eyes who kept glancing toward the street like he was hoping for backup. "Who authorized this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from boiling over. He held out a folded work order signed by Vivian Thorne. "We got instructions," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Who says the structure was already failing, creating a safety hazard? We're just here to remove dangerous materials." The audacity of it almost made me laugh. Dangerous materials? Those dangerous materials were the only thing holding back half a hillside, but the damage was already done. The truck rumbled off, carrying 5 years of design, labor, and permits gone in an afternoon. I filed a trespassing report with the police, contacted my insurance company, and documented every inch of the destruction. But the real harm wasn't to the wall, it was to the land. Standing in the wreckage, I could feel it as something fundamental had changed. The soil felt different underfoot, less anchored, like something that had been tightly held in place was suddenly loose and unpredictable. That night, I stood at my back window, watching the disturbed slope under moonlight. Puddles were forming in odd places where drainage used to carry water away. A few plants had already begun to lean, and in the soft glow, I could just make out hairline cracks spreading through the exposed dirt. The mountain was stirring. Gravity, long held at bay by engineering, was waking up. But why had Eleanor risked so much just to send me that warning? What exactly did she know, and who was she afraid of? The secret Eleanor's keeping might unravel everything. The next morning, I did what any decent engineer does when faced with a new variable. I measured. I bought a pack of orange survey flags from the hardware store and placed a dozen of them across the exposed slope, each one numbered and measured precisely from the edge of my porch. If the land was shifting, I'd track exactly how fast and how far. By day 4, I had the evidence I didn't want. Every single flag had moved. Some by just an inch or two. Others had crept a full 4 inches downhill. Drainage had worsened. Areas of soggy soil had turned marshy, where once water had flowed cleanly. 3 young trees had begun to lean at unnatural angles, their roots pulled by the slow motion of the earth beneath them. I photographed everything, time-stamped it, compiled it into a new report. Then I picked up the phone. Vivian answered on the 4th ring. Even before I said a word, I could hear the irritation in her voice. "Vivian, this is Arthur Sterling. I began. You need to hear this. The slope is beginning to move. I have photographic evidence. See a measurable ground shift. We need to act, immediately. There was silence. 5 seconds, maybe 6, then she hung up. No questions, no concern, not even a pretense of interest in the safety of her own neighborhood. My next call was to the county. I filed an emergency report with the building department, but they told me it would take several days to process. We might not have that long, so I did the only thing I could think of. I went door to door. I printed out the most jarring images I could find of mudslides from across California. Homes tilted at impossible angles, driveways turned into rivers, entire streets swallowed by dirt. And I brought my own photos too. The leaning flags, the cracked earth, the displaced trees. This, I told anyone who would listen, is what happens when engineers are ignored. The first person to take me seriously was Patrick Caldwell, a civil rights attorney who'd moved in 6 months earlier. Sharp, level-headed, the kind of man who respected facts. I showed him the survey data, the photos, the slope calculations. You're not the type to make this up, he finally said. What do you need from me? For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone. But not everyone was ready to listen. When I knocked on the young neighbor's door, she opened it just wide enough to glare at me. I'm done listening to your fear-mongering, she snapped. You're making people panic for no reason. Vivian told us what you're doing, trying to scare everyone into bringing back that eyesore of a wall. Well, it's gone, and we're fine. She slammed the door before I could say another word. Some people, I realized, would rather stand on a crumbling hill than admit they were wrong. Thankfully, the older neighbor was beginning to see the cracks literally and figuratively. When I showed him the photos of the shifting flags and disturbed slope, he invited me inside. Quietly, he led me to a back room, then turned to me with a hushed voice. Arthur, he said, there's something you need to know. I want to show you something, the elderly neighbor said quietly. He led me into a back room and knelt beside the far wall, pulling a marble from his pocket. He set it gently on the hardwood floor. We both watched in silence as it rolled slowly and steadily toward the rear corner of the room. That started 3 days ago, he said, not taking his eyes off it. The whole floor is tilting toward the hillside. That's not normal, is it? That evening, just after sunset, Eleanor appeared at my door. She looked over her shoulder before stepping inside, her hands twisting nervously. She was pale, eyes darting around the room like it might be wired for sound. Arthur, she said, voice low and shaking, I think you are right about everything. There are things, emails, internal messages you need to see. She stopped herself, scanning the walls again. Her fear was palpable. What kind of communications? I asked gently. I can't. She shook her head violently. She made me promise. I swore I wouldn't tell anyone. But, Arthur, people could die. What am I supposed to do? I could see the battle raging behind her eyes, a fear and guilt warring for control. Eleanor, I said, you could save lives. What's your silence worth? She began to cry. Quiet, restrained sobs that she wiped away with the cuffs of her flower print blouse. You don't understand, she whispered. She destroys people. I've seen it, Vivian. She's capable of things you wouldn't believe. But even as she said it, I could tell, her conscience had already made the decision. A woman like Eleanor couldn't live with herself if someone got hurt and she'd done nothing to stop it. On day 6, it happened. The first visible crack, a hairline fracture, about 1/4 inch wide and 12 feet long, etched itself across the exposed slope fascia running perpendicular to the hillside. To most, it might have looked like a minor blemish, but to an engineer, it was the first sign of something much larger. Cracks like that don't form without immense subterranean stress. I documented it from every angle and immediately fired off an urgent email to the county. Subject: ground movement detected. Immediate inspection required. I called the local news station. The editor sounded half interested. We can't run a story based on a single homeowner's claim, he said. Do you have a geotechnical report? A statement from county engineers? I didn't. Not yet. But I knew it wouldn't matter soon. Gravity doesn't wait for paperwork. That night, my phone buzzed. A blocked number. The message was short. I have something you need to see, but I'm terrified. She made me promise never to tell anyone. I didn't need to ask who sent it. Eleanor had made her decision. Her conscience had finally won, I replied. When and where? The answer came immediately. Tomorrow night, after she leaves for book club. Meet me at the park entrance. I'll find you. I stared at my phone, heart pounding. What kind of evidence would make someone like Eleanor risk everything? And why was she so afraid of Vivian? What kind of power did Vivian Thorne hold over people? The next morning, at exactly 6 a.m., I was jolted awake by the roar of machinery. Through my bedroom window, I saw it, a yellow excavator and 2 dump trucks positioned at the base of the slope. Summit Landscaping was back, but this time, they weren't clearing debris, they were digging, tearing into the hillside with a small bulldozer, stripping away what little vegetation remained and carving into the fragile earth like it was a garden bed. I grabbed my phone, threw on my robe, and ran outside, recording everything. Hey, I yelled. What the hell do you think you're doing? The same crew chief looked up from a clipboard, avoiding my eyes. Got orders to level it all out, he said flatly. Slopes uneven, makes the neighborhood look bad. Do you even have permits for this? Engineering oversight, erosion control plans? He shrugged. We just do what we're told. Take it up with the lady in charge. That's when I saw her, Vivian, sitting across the street in her car, watching the destruction unfold like a general at the edge of a battlefield. I stormed over and knocked on her window. She rolled it down slowly. Her face was drawn, eyes shadowed by dark circles, fingernails chewed to the quick. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. Vivian, I said, trying to keep my voice level. You have to stop this, right now. You're destabilizing the entire slope. People are going to get hurt. Her reaction caught me off guard. No smug deflection, no political smile, just raw panic. Stop asking questions, she snapped, her voice brittle. It'll be fine. We've gone too far to turn back now. She looked like someone trapped in her own decisions, unable to reverse course without admitting the damage she'd caused. A woman on the edge of collapse. And in that moment, I realized, Vivian wasn't just hiding something, she was running from it. Vivian, I said more gently this time, it's not too late. Stop the digging, bring in real engineers. But she was already rolling up her window, head shaking furiously. Too far, she muttered. We've gone too far. By 10 a.m., my phone rang. Mr. Sterling, this is the county building department. We've reviewed your emergency report from yesterday. I'm heading to your location now. 30 minutes later, a young inspector named Rodriguez pulled up in a county vehicle. One look at my flagged measurements and his expression turned grim. Sir, he said, this is a code red. We're talking about the potential for catastrophic slope failure. He spent 2 solid hours surveying, photographing, and documenting the scene. By noon, he was on the phone with his supervisors, his voice urgent. By 6 o'clock that evening, the county posted an official hazard warning. Red plastic tape cordoned off the lower half of every backyard, with signs that read, Danger unstable slope, keep out. County vehicles circled the neighborhood. Officials went door to door, advising residents to stay off patios, avoid backyards, and prepare for possible evacuation. The local news showed up shortly after. Microphones and cameras turned toward confused and nervous neighbors, asking how they felt about the sudden geological emergency. And just like that, my warnings no longer seemed like the ravings of a paranoid engineer, but the community split right down the middle. Some residents began stacking sandbags and drafting evacuation plans. Others, led by the outspoken younger neighbor, launched a petition in support of Vivian. We won't be bullied by one alarmist and his friends in government, she declared to a news camera. This is about property rights and community self-determination. Somehow, physics had become a political issue. That evening, the elderly neighbor invited me over again. He lived in his 1973 built home for decades, a solid structure on a concrete foundation. But now, he showed me something deeply unsettling. He placed the same marble on his back room floor, and this time, it didn't just roll, it accelerated. The whole house is leaning, he whispered. My wife says I'm imagining things. But now the bathroom door won't stay shut. It swings open on its own. I brought over my level and took readings. The floor was off by nearly 2 degrees. In structural terms, that's not just concerning it's dire. Later that night, around 10 p.m., I heard the sound every geotechnical engineer dreads, a deep, low rumble from beneath the earth, like the ground itself was growling. I rushed outside just in time to witness a 6-foot section of the exposed hillside slid down in a violent lurch, ripping loose a young pine tree and Vivian's top-of-the-line irrigation system. It lasted less than 10 seconds. When it was over, the slope wore a gash like an open wound. Raw, exposed, and angry, I captured the whole thing on video and immediately shared it with the county, the news media, and every neighbor I could reach. Moments later, my phone rang again. It was Eleanor. Her voice was faint, nearly a whisper. "Arthur." She knew this would happen. "I have proof." My pulse jumped. "What kind of proof?" A pause. Then, emails, internal memos, from before anything started. "She made me swear on my mother's grave that I'd never show anyone. But after seeing that slide." "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice calm, "you could save lives. What would your mother want you to do?" Another long silence. "I've been holding something back," she admitted. "Something that proves she knew, from the beginning. She knew exactly what would happen if that wall gave way." She hesitated again. "But you have to promise to protect me, Arthur. You don't know what she's capable of. She has ways of destroying people, real ways." I promised, though, in truth, I didn't know how I'd keep her safe. What I did know was this: Eleanor held the key to exposing Vivian's negligence. And after that night's slide, time was no longer on our side. The mountain was waking up, and once it moved, nothing would stop it. The only question was whether we could uncover the truth before gravity finished what Vivian had started. Eleanor had been keeping something buried. And now, as the ground itself threatened to collapse, so was everything else she tried to keep hidden. What had she known from the beginning, and what was about to be revealed that would change everything? What happens next? Week 8 opened with me distributing emergency evacuation flyers to every house on the block. The hardwood floors in the neighbor's house had started to separate out gaps wide enough to slide a coin through. Ran between the boards. "My wife wants to call our daughter, maybe stay with her for a few days," he said, uncertainty etched across his face. "You think that's overreacting?" I looked down at his visibly tilted floor. "No," I said. "It's the smartest thing you can do." While I was focused on the physical dangers, Patrick had been working tirelessly on our legal case. But the real breakthrough, the kind that could actually hold Vivian accountably, was still buried deep in Eleanor's conscience. "She's terrified," Patrick told me. "I tried to talk to her about testifying. She nearly bolted out the door." "What kind of grip does Vivian have on these people?" I wondered aloud. I didn't have to wait long to find out. That afternoon, while sorting through a pile of misdelivered mail, something caught my eye. A crumpled envelope addressed to a Marlow Heights resident had somehow ended up in my trash bin. The return address was from a downtown law firm. Inside was a confidential geological safety report dated 3 months prior. My hands went cold. It was a formal engineering assessment commissioned by the HOA, signed by a licensed civil engineer. The conclusion was unambiguous: maintain all existing slope stabilization structures. Removal of retaining walls may result in catastrophic slope failure. Vivian had known. She'd hired an expert, gotten a clear warning, and then suppressed the report because it didn't align with her agenda. She'd gone ahead and demolished the wall anyway. When I showed the document to Eleanor, the color drained from her face. "She made me promise never to show anyone," she whispered, tears streaking down her cheeks. "She said if it got out that we'd commissioned a study and ignored it, the liability would destroy the HOA. People's property values would tank. She made me swear on my mother's grave." Eleanor had lived with that guilt for months, silently watching the slope erode, terrified of what she knew was coming. "I couldn't sleep, Arthur," she said. "I'd lie awake at night thinking about kids playing in those backyards." And then, the weather turned. The forecast warned of sustained heavy rainfall over the weekend. That's when I made a decision, one my family would later debate as either heroic or recklessly stupid. While most sane people evacuated, I stayed behind. I set up a battery-powered emergency radio system and positioned myself as a human early warning siren. If the slope was going to fail, someone had to be there to witness it and sound the alarm. Friday evening, the rain began. Not a storm, just a slow, relentless soak that penetrated the already compromised soil. Around 10 p.m., I heard a sound I'll never forget, a wet sliding, followed by a sharp crack. The elderly neighbor's garden shed had partially collapsed. A 15-foot section of his yard had slumped toward the canyon, dragging the shed and his prized rose bushes with it. I grabbed the radio mic. "This is Arthur Sterling. Evacuate immediately. Anyone near the slope leave now." The younger neighbor, who had been live streaming the entire saga on her phone, caught my warning on video. "Nobody listened to Arthur," she cried into her camera as emergency lights flashed in the distance. "Look what's happening." The engineer was right. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a grim sort of validation. Being right, it turns out, isn't about ego, it's about lives. But any satisfaction vanished the next morning. 10:02 a.m. I was jolted awake by a sound that defied description, a louder than thunder, deeper than an earthquake, a seismic, roaring crack as if the earth itself had lost its grip. I ran to the window. A massive section of the hillside, mud, rock, vegetation gave way all at once. Tons of earth cascaded down in a roaring wave. It lasted nearly 30 seconds. In that short time, everything changed. The community park disappeared, swallowed by a moving river of mud and debris. 3 homes suffered partial structural damage as their foundations shifted. One of them, a beautifully restored 1920s craftsman, was now tilted at such an angle that the front porch nearly aligned with the second-story windows. But the most horrifying sight was the red house at the end of the street. The lights were still on. I knew the elderly couple who lived there hadn't left. I didn't think. I just ran, grabbing my emergency flashlight and climbing gear. I made my way across the fractured landscape. "There's someone still inside," I shouted at the first responders arriving at the scene. The house had tilted but hadn't collapsed. Carefully, I pushed through the warped front door and found the couple huddled together in their bedroom, terrified, but unharmed. It took 20 painstaking minutes to guide them out safely. They made it with nothing worse than bruises and the trauma of watching their entire world collapse in real time. And then came the moment that gave this story its name. 10:02 a.m., the same moment the slope gave way, as emergency lights danced across the mud-soaked wreckage and dazed neighbors emerged from their homes in disbelief. Someone found Vivian. She was walking barefoot through the sludge in her pajamas. Her hair was matted, her eyes were vacant. A paramedic approached her gently. She didn't seem to register him. She just kept mumbling, over and over, "I said it would be fine, it would be fine. I told everyone it would be fine." And then finally, as she looked up and saw the full extent of the devastation her choices had wrought, houses leaned at impossible angles, the entire neighborhood transformed into a geological nightmare. Then Vivian Thorne let out a scream, a raw, piercing cry that woke everyone within 6 blocks. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was the sound of a mind breaking under the crushing weight of catastrophic choices. The scream echoed off the canyon walls, lingering like a primal howl, a desperate acknowledgement that her so-called vision had destroyed everything she claimed to protect. By sunrise, Vivian had vanished. No forwarding address, no explanation, no attempt to face the wreckage she'd caused. The county posted unsafe to occupy signs on 3 homes, and the Red Cross set up an emergency shelter at the community center. News crews swarmed the scene, interviewing survivors and filming the devastation. But Vivian? She'd disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the memory of that haunting scream behind. Where had she gone, and what would she do next to escape the consequences of her actions? If you think Vivian was already plotting her comeback from the shadows, type vanished. Within 48 hours of the disaster, the blame game was in full swing. Anonymous flyers began appearing in mailboxes all over the neighborhood. They carried a brutal message: engineer causes millions in damage. Arthur Sterling's unauthorized wall diverted groundwater, destabilizing natural drainage and causing catastrophic slope failure. The flyers looked professional, printed on glossy paper with detailed geological diagrams. Whoever was behind this disinformation campaign had invested serious money. Rumors spread faster than facts ever could. Social media buzzed with theories about how my artificial structure had upset the hillside's natural balance. Neighbors who'd smiled and waved for years now crossed the street to avoid me. I was isolated in my own community, branded the villain in a disaster I'd spent months trying to prevent. It was psychological warfare, yeah, and it was working. Patrick sprang into action, hiring an independent geological expert to examine the slope failure. Dr. Sarah Martinez, professor emeritus at the State University, had over 40 years' experience in soil mechanics and slope stability. After 3 days of analysis, her conclusion was clear. The retaining wall would have prevented this disaster. The failure happened exactly where the wall had been removed, and the pattern of damage matched the loss of artificial slope support. But Vivian's lawyers were already spinning their own story. They claimed that non-native structures had altered the hillside's natural behavior, casting doubt on whether the wall was actually beneficial. The legal fight looked grim. Without a smoking gun piece of evidence, Eleanor warned it was my word against a well-funded campaign of lies. The HOA's insurance company hired lawyers skilled at shifting blame away from their clients. They brought in expert witnesses willing to claim retaining walls sometimes create hydraulic pressures that destabilize slopes, even if those theories contradicted basic engineering principles. In court, doubt was often enough to avoid liability. I started questioning myself. Late at night, sitting in my damaged house with cracks running through the ceiling from the ground shift, I wondered, had I missed something? Was there a flaw in my original design? Could I have contributed to this disaster without realizing it? During one tense strategy session, I asked Patrick, what if there really is a flaw I don't see? He looked me in the eye and said, Arthur, that's exactly what they want you to think. Don't let them gaslight you into doubting your expertise. Eleanor had been avoiding me ever since the collapse, too scared to answer her phone or reply to messages. Finally, I caught her at the grocery store. She looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight. I have the emails, she whispered, glancing nervously around, but they're on my old computer. Something's wrong with the files. They won't open. My heart sank. What do you mean? They won't open. She explained that her computer had crashed the day after the landslide. When the repair shop recovered the data, many files appeared corrupted. The one we needed most showed up as complete gibberish. For 3 agonizing days, we worked with a data recovery specialist, trying to piece together Eleanor's damaged email files. Meanwhile, the legal pressure kept mounting. The HOA's lawyers filed motions claiming I was responsible for the disaster and demanded I cover all damages. Local news outlets, fed stories by Vivian's supporters, began questioning whether I'd engineered the original wall properly. Without that crucial email, Patrick warned me bluntly, we're going to lose everything. They've got better lawyers and a more convincing story, Patrick said grimly. On the 3rd night, as I stared at Eleanor's broken computer files, I felt 37 years of my professional reputation crumble into dust. 37 years of engineering, I muttered to my empty house, defeated by a corrupted hard drive. I'd built bridges carrying thousands of cars daily, designed earthquake-proof foundations, and consulted on projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But none of that mattered if I couldn't prove what Vivian had known and when she knew it. Then, at 11:30 that night, the data recovery specialist called with the best news I'd heard in weeks. Got it? He said simply. The email file is clean now. You'll want to see this immediately. I drove straight to his office in my pajamas, not caring how I looked. When he opened the recovered file, I saw the evidence that would change everything. An email from Vivian to Eleanor, dated 2 weeks before my wall was removed, held the most damning admission imaginable. Even if he's right about the safety issues, Vivian had written, that wall still has to go. It's about setting a precedent. If we let him keep it, everyone will think they can build whatever they want. The community aesthetic guidelines are more important than one engineer's paranoid theories. But the smoking gun was in the next paragraph. I know the geological report recommends keeping it, but we can't let technical considerations override our vision for the neighborhood. She had known my warnings were correct, ignored her own experts, and went ahead anyway. I called Patrick immediately. Game over. I meant it. Within hours, we filed an emergency motion with that email as our centerpiece evidence. But I wanted more than a legal victory. I wanted the whole community to see the kind of person they'd been backing. I called for an emergency neighborhood meeting and rented the community center's projection system. When I displayed that email on a screen large enough for everyone to read, The room fell silent. Those words, "even if he's right," hung heavy like a confession. The young neighbor who had been Vivian's loudest supporter quietly gathered her things and left without looking at anyone. The elderly neighbor whose house had been damaged in the collapse stood up and walked over to me. "I should have trusted you from the start, Arthur," he said loudly enough for all to hear. "Can you forgive an old fool for doubting an expert?" One by one, other neighbors came forward with similar apologies. The truth was finally out, and it was devastating. The next morning brought a formal invitation that surprised me more than anything else in this ordeal. The remaining residents had unanimously voted to offer me the position of HOA president. "Maybe it's time." An engineer sat at the decision table. I told Patrick with the first real smile I'd had in months. But would this victory last? Or was there one final twist waiting to destroy everything I'd fought for? The ending will leave you speechless. BD Stories reveals what happens when the good guys actually win. Share your ultimate justice moment below. 2 months after the collapse, I stood at a podium in the county administrative building, presenting my case to a room full of engineers, planners, and elected officials. I had prepared a simple demonstration using children's building blocks and a small ramp to show exactly how retaining walls work and what happens when they're removed. Sometimes, the most complex engineering principles can be explained with the simplest tools. When I finished, the chief county engineer asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Mr. Sterling, why weren't you on the HOA board from the beginning?" The room erupted in laughter when I answered, "I offered to serve multiple times. They said I was too technical." Even the county lawyers smiled. It was ironic that the community rejected technical expertise in favor of aesthetics, then suffered the predictable consequences. The county's official statement that afternoon was clear and firm. The structural collapse was a direct result of the unauthorized removal of a permitted retaining wall. The disaster could have been prevented if proper engineering protocols had been followed. The legal aftermath was swift and decisive. The HOA was completely dissolved through lawsuits, insurance claims, and financial liabilities beyond its capacity to function. Vivian never returned to face the consequences. Without her testimony, criminal charges weren't possible, but civil liability was a different story. Every damaged homeowner received full compensation, funded by the HOA's insurance and supplemented by Vivian's seized assets. Justice isn't always perfect, but sometimes, it's enough. Taking on the HOA presidency felt like stepping into a new world. My first action was to scrap all aesthetic-based restrictions and replace them with safety-focused guidelines. Instead of arguing over paint colors and garden designs, we formed a technical advisory committee to review any project with structural or safety implications. The transformation was remarkable. Neighbors who barely spoke before began collaborating on practical improvements that benefited everyone. I used my settlement money to rebuild the retaining wall, but this time, I added something special. Along the top, I installed stone benches where people could sit and safely enjoy the canyon view. At the base, a small bronze plaque read simply, "In memory of a lesson, listen to the builders." It wasn't about ego or vindication. It was about ensuring future residents understood the importance of respecting expertise over opinions. The personal moments meant more to me than any legal victory. 3 months after the disaster, my son brought my 8-year-old granddaughter to visit. I taught her about gravity and slope stability with a simple demonstration using a marble and a cardboard ramp. "Why didn't people listen to you, Grandpa?" she asked, with the honesty only children possess. I thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes," I said, "people are more afraid of being wrong than being right." "Sweetie, sometimes people confuse what they want to be true with what actually is true," I told my granddaughter gently. The transformation in the neighborhood was impossible to miss. Vivian's former meditation gardenia, once more about appearances than purpose, had blossomed into a thriving community vegetable garden where neighbors shared tools, seeds, and harvests. The strict Christmas light rules were gone, replaced by a wonderfully chaotic display of individual creativity. Some houses went all out with elaborate decorations, while others kept it simply, but every display reflected the personality of its owner instead of some committee-approved uniformity. What surprised me most was how often people began coming to me for advice before making changes to their properties. Not because I was HOA president, but because the disaster had taught everyone the value of consulting someone who actually understood structural engineering. Simple conversations that prevented problems became routine. "Arthur, I want to add a deck. What do I need to know about the foundation?" These weren't formal consultations, just neighbors helping neighbors with practical knowledge. 4 months after taking over as president, I received an email that reminded me this story was far from over. The subject line read, "Regional HOA Reform Committee, we need your expertise." The message explained that communities across 3 counties were facing the same issue: HOA boards making decisions without proper technical knowledge, homeowners paying the price as aesthetic priorities overrode safety concerns. They wanted my help developing new standards and training programs. I showed the email to Patrick over coffee at our local diner. "Think you are running for city council next?" He joked, but as I looked out the window at our rebuilt neighborhood where children played safely in yards protected by proper engineering, and neighbors cooperated instead of competing, I realized the work was only just beginning. There were probably hundreds of Vivian Thornes out there, making aesthetic decisions about structural issues they didn't understand. That evening, Eleanor stopped by with a plate of homemade cookies and an apology she'd been practicing for months. "You saved my soul, Arthur," she said simply. "I was so scared of standing up to her, I almost let people die. Thank you for showing me that some promises aren't worth keeping." Eleanor volunteered to testify at Reform Committee hearings, sharing her experience of being intimidated into silence by an authoritarian board member. Her courage inspired other treasurers and secretaries to speak out about similar situations. 6 months later, the young neighbor who'd been Vivian's most vocal supporter approached me at the hardware store. She didn't apologize directly, but she did something better. "I'm taking some engineering courses at the community college," she said quietly. "Turns out I don't know as much about structural design as I thought." Small victories but meaningful ones. That evening, standing on my reinforced hillside and watching my granddaughter play safely in a place that had once been dangerous, I thought about the lesson this whole experience had taught me. I'd built that first wall to hold back dirt and rocks, but what I really held on to through months of ridicule and isolation was something more important: the community's trust. Once that trust was rebuilt on a foundation of truth instead of politics, it became stronger than any retaining wall I'd ever engineered. Looking at the email invitation still glowing on my phone screen, I smiled. Heroes, it seemed, don't get to retire. There's always another community that needs someone willing to choose facts over feelings, safety over aesthetics, and expertise over authority. And that's perfectly fine with me. If this story of justice served cold gave you the satisfying feeling we all crave, smash that like button. And if you believe in supporting creators who expose the truth about power-hungry hoes, there's a thanks button below that helps keep these stories coming. Your support means everything. I'm your host, Anna Dramanest, and I'll see you in the next episode where we dive into another case of someone getting exactly what they deserved. Until then, remember, physics always wins, but sometimes it takes a while to collect the debt. We don't make this stuff up. Real people are just this wild. Anna Dramanest proves it. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next unbelievable episode.